Hello everyone, welcome to the course Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. If you remember, in the last lecture we were talking about auditory perception. We talked a little bit about the physiology of the ear and some physical characteristics of the sound. We also talked about we started talking about the theories on theories of speech perception. The theory we were talking about while I ended the last lecture was the motor theory of speech perception, and we will try and continue from there onwards in this lecture as well. Now, an interesting effect of the motor theory of speech perception is basically that it says that understanding speech gestures requires one to figure out whatever gestures have created any given acoustic signal. The system therefore uses or will require to use any sort of information that can help identify these gestures. Now, while acoustic stimuli offer cues as to what those gestures possibly are, the help can be taken from other perceptual systems as well. If the perceptual systems can provide this kind of help, they can provide any kind of clue as to what the gestures are. The motor theory says that the speech perception system will take up this information, use this information and use it in understanding speech. In fact, two non-auditory perceptual systems like vision and touch have already been shown to affect speech perception, and the most famous demonstration of this multimodal effect on speech perception is the McGurk effect, which first was reported by McGurk and McDonald in 1976. Now, this McGurk effect you can find a lot of videos about on YouTube, etc., but the crux of this McGurk effect is that this happens when people are watching a video of a person talking, but the audio portion of the tape has been altered. For example, the video might be showing a person speaking g, but the audio signal is of a person speaking b. Generally what happens is that people perceive neither g or ba, they perceive a combination which comes out as the sound of d. So, what is happening is the person is saying g, you are hearing g, but the video is of saying ba. And what the system is doing, it is combining these two information in some sense and coming up with an entirely new sound, that is da. Why is this happening? This is happening because if the visual system information is removed, the auditory information is accurately perceived and the person hears ba. So, if you kind of close your eyes and listen to this information, the visual thing is gone and then you will correctly perceive whatever the person was saying as ba. Now, this McGurk effect has been shown to be incredibly robust. It happens even when people are fully warned, even if they are told that see the audio is different, video is different, you have to still try and understand it. It still happens. People still cannot really control integrating of these two information and coming up with this third category. Now, the McGurk effect happens because our speech perception system combines both visual and auditory information for perceiving speech rather than relying on the visual or auditory perception alone. Of course, the auditory information by itself is sometimes sufficient for perception to occur, but the McGurk effect shows that the visual information also influences a speech perception whenever it is available. Say for example, if you are talking on phone, these kind of effects are certainly not there. The McGurk effect is an example of what is called the multimodal perception, because two sensory modalities, visual and auditory, are actually being used in order to create the subjective experience of the sound. Another way to create a variant of the McGurk effect is by combining haptic information with auditory information to change the way that people perceive a spoken syllable. This kind of perception that occurs outside the laboratory from time to time in a specialized module is called tadoma. Now, Helen Keller, people who are visually impaired, sometimes they learn to speak by using their sense of touch to feel whatever articulatory information is presented. Remember, we are still talking about the motor theory of speech perception, and the goal is still to identify whatever gestures were used, and that is supposed to help us understand the sound. Now, Carol Fowler did this experiment and they actually she had her participants of the experiment feel her lips while they listened to a recording of a female speaker speaking a variety of syllables. Now, blindfolded and gloves, these experimental participants heard the syllable g over the speaker, while Carol Fowler simultaneously mouthed the syllable b. Again, as in the McGurk effect, traditionally they reported hearing the syllable of d. The motor theory explains both these versions of the McGurk effect, the visual and the haptic one, as stemming from the same basic processes. As the goal of the speech production system is not a spectral analysis of the auditory input, rather it is to figure out the set of gestures that have been producing these sounds. The motor theory tries to tell us that both of these information, the visual and haptic, are basically being used in order to make these judgments, and that is what is leading to this combined perception that is happening. Under natural circumstances, the visual, auditory and touch informations will anyways all line up and they will not be conflicting like in the case of the McGurk effect video. So in that sense it will all work fine, but if you are creating an experimental situation like this, it might lead to confusion like we saw in the perception of the syllable duh. The motor theory of speech perception repeatedly talks about the importance of understanding the motor aspects of speech, and it has been basically a very popular theory, but say for example another way was found which could help and support the motor theory of speech perception. This other way was a chance discovery by researchers who were working on macaque monkeys, and they discovered that particular neurons in the monkey's frontal cortex responded when the monkey performed the action, but they also responded when the monkey observed a particular action. These neurons were referred to as the mirror neurons. Now, the existence of mirror neurons in monkeys was established by invasive single cell recordings, and in that sense they have not these kind of recordings because they are not possible to do with humans. There is a hypothesis that the human brain, which is very similar to the monkey brain, also contains these similar kind of neurons. However, the part of the brain of the macaques that have the mirror neurons is similar to the Broca's area of the brain, which also is involved incidentally in production of speech. So, it also does something motor which is related to speech. You can remember the Broca's area from the lecture I gave on the brain and behavior thing. Neuroimaging and research involving direct recording from neurons in the Broca's areas show that Broca's area participates in speech perception. Now, researchers who discovered mirror neurons proposed that the mirror neurons could be the neurological mechanisms that the motor theory of speech perception requires. That is, these mirror neurons in the Broca's area could fire when an individual produces a particular set of phonemes or hear the particular set of phonemes, and providing the bridge between speaking and listening. So, if you are speaking a set of phonemes, the mirror neurons in the Broca's area are firing, and if you are listening to the particular sound, the same neurons are firing again, so that there is the same neurological structure that is involved both in speaking and listening. There have been experiments conducted to non-invasively find evidence for the participation of mirror neurons or the participation of the motor cortex in speech perception. Obviously, the motor cortex has been known to participate while speech production is there, but remember we are talking about speech perception. The motor theory says that accessing the representations of specific speech gestures must underlie speech perception. The representations of these speech gestures must be stored in the parts of the brain that control articulatory movements. Wherever those parts of the brain which are involved in making these movements must also be the parts of the brain that store this information about what gestures have been used. The parts of the brain that control articulation are the motor cortex in the frontal lobes of the brain and the adjacent premotor cortex that are used when we perceive speech. Now, the proponent of the mirror neurons argue that mirror neurons are basically the neural mechanism that will establish the link between heard speech and the motor representations that underlie speech production. Mirror neurons have recently been found in the monkey equivalent of the motor cortex as well, and so the proponents of mirror neurons view this as evidence of the fact that our motor neurons respond to speech perception as well. Some mirror neuron theorists argue further that mirror neurons also play a role in modern humans because our speech perception and production process are evolving from a manual gesture system. The theory about language evolution is that because we are using manual gestures initially, that is why our mirror neuron or motor cortex is involved in perception and production of speech as well. That is a story for another day, but let us examine some evidence about this involvement of mirror neurons or the motor cortex in human speech perception. So, Pulvermuller and colleagues, they conducted a study wherein participants were to listen syllables that resulted from either bilabial stops like p or b or alveolar stops like t or d on listening trials. On silent production trials, these participants imagine themselves making these sounds. So, there is production and perception both happening. Measurements of the brain activity were gathered using fMRI. If you remember, fMRI basically measures the amount of flow of oxygenated blood to the areas that are involved in particular cognitive tasks. Now, listening to the speech caused substantial activity in the superior parts of the temporal lobes on both sides of the participant's brain, but it also caused a lot of activity in the motor cortex in the experimental participants' frontal lobes. Further, brain activity in the motor cortex depended on what kind of speech sounds the participants were listening to. So, there were different activations depending on whether the sound was a bilabial stop or an alveolar stop. This result is explained by the motor theory, and they say that the same areas that produce this speech are involved in perceiving it. So, it is one kind of a confirmatory evidence. In another study, when TMS was applied to a participant's motor cortex, participants were less able to tell the difference between two similar phonemes. So, if those areas are not working, your perception and understanding of these two phonemes might also be attenuated. Further, when people listen to speech sounds that involve tongue movements and have TMS applied to parts of the motor cortex that control the tongue, increased motor evoked potentials are observed in the participant's tongue muscles. So, there is some processing happening there as well. All of these experiments put together show that the motor cortex indeed generates neural activity in response to listening speech, consistent with what the motor theory has been saying. But there have been some challenges to the motor theory of speech perception as well. Some of the challenges are rooted in the link that they make between perception and production. You can say, for example, infants are fully capable of perceiving and understanding speech despite the fact that they are thoroughly incapable of producing these speech sounds. To account for these results, we will either have to conclude that the infants are born with this innate set of speech motor representations, or that having a speech motor representations is not necessary for perceiving phonemes. If we accept the latter, we are kind of violating what the motor theory was saying. Additional experiments have also cast doubt on whether speech motor representations are necessary for speech perception. Now, no one would suggest that non-human animals have a supply of speech motor representations which pertain to human speech sounds, but it has been found that animals like the Japanese quail and chinchillas, they also respond to a particular class of speech sounds and refrain from responding to other class of speech sounds, telling us that they have this aspect of speech perception and they can differentiate between these different sounds. Now, the motor theory would say that they also know which gestures are involved in producing these, which kind of is a non-starter. Because these animals lack the human articulatory apparatus, they cannot have the speech motor representations, as I was saying, but as they respond to these different aspects of speech very much like humans would do, the motor theories claim that speech motor representations are a necessary part of speech perception is kind of weakened. Further research with aphasic patients also casts doubt on the motor theory. Say, for example, both Broca and Wernick, they showed that some brain damaged patients could not produce speech but understand it, while others could understand speech but not produce speech. If you were to listen to the motor theory's claims, then you will say that this is not really possible. The existence of these clear dissociations between speech perception and production systems provides strong evidence against the account of the motor theory. Also, if speech perception requires access to intact motor representations, then brain damage that impairs spoken language output should also impair spoken language comprehension, as I was saying. Now, the final problem or another problem about this account is basically that one has to say the same speech sounds can be produced by different articulatory gestures. It has been shown in a study by McNeilage in 1970. More specifically, different people can produce the same phoneme by altering configurations of the vocal tract, because the vocal tract offers a number of locations where the airflow can be restricted, and because different combinations of airflow restrictions have the same physical effect, they wind up producing similar acoustic signals and which are indistinguishable to the perceiver. So, a perceiver might be listening to two different the same sound being produced by different articulators and different kinds of gestural scores. Then it becomes very difficult to say that a single gesture is responsible for a sound like G. You can say that there are multiple gestures. Now, studies involving, and there's these interesting experiments done by called the bite block vowels, when people are keeping something in their mouth and then producing the sound and the participants can still understand it. It says that the motor theory is kind of weakening here. The motor theory if given a chance, will try to account for this set of findings in one of two ways. They will say either more than one speech motor representation goes with a given phoneme, or that there is a single set prototype of speech motor representations, and that an acoustic analysis of speech signals determine which of these ideal gestures most closely match the acoustic output. Now, if you see this closely, that both of these things will violate the spirit of what the motor theory is saying. I will just repeat this once more. So, two reasons what they can give is, they can say that more than one speech motor representation can go with a given phoneme, or they can say that there is a single prototype which can be matched to any given gesture. Both of these things are contradictory to what the motor theory of speech perception has originally claimed. In that sense, it is kind of weakened and it is not able to explain all the findings. So, when there are flaws with a particular big theory, there are other theories that jump in. The other important theory of speech perception is the general auditory approach to speech perception. Now, the general auditory approach basically says it starts with the assumption that speech sounds must be perceived or are perceived using the same mechanisms of audition and perceptual learning that have evolved in humans to handle all other classes of sounds as well. So, it says that speech perception is not really special, you understand speech as you understand all the other sounds. Researchers in the general auditory tradition look for consistent patterns in acoustic signals for speech that appear whenever particular speech properties are present. Further, they seek to explain commonalities in the way different people and even different species react to aspects of speech. For example, some studies have looked at the way in which people and animals respond to what are called voicing contrasts. Say for example, the example I was talking about, purr and burr. These studies have suggested that our ability to perceive voicing is related to the fundamental properties of the auditory system and not really a special module that was proposed by this motor theory. We can tell whether two sounds occurred simultaneously if they begin more than 20 milliseconds apart. So, it is just a matter of time and not really that it is a special speech signal. So, if two sounds are presented within 20 milliseconds of each other, we will perceive them as being simultaneous in time. If one starts 20 milliseconds before or after another, we start perceiving them in one before the other in different sounds. The voicing boundary for people and quails, by the way, sits right at the same difference of 20 milliseconds. Now, you can see that this is this generality between human auditory perception system and the quail's auditory perception system. By the way, quail is a particular bird. If the vocal fold vibration starts within 20 milliseconds of the burst, we will perceive the phoneme as voiced. If it starts after 20 milliseconds, we will perceive it as unvoiced. Purr and burr, the same example we have been talking about. So, this aspect of this general aspect to phonological perception then could be said to be based on a fundamental property of auditory perception rather than the peculiarities of gesture that go into voiced and unvoiced. So, if I were a auditory perception system, I do not really need to keep tab of whether it is voiced or not voiced. I will just keep track of time, and if the time is sufficiently apart, I will treat them as different. I can be a quail or any other animal and still do this task perfectly. The general auditory approach also does not offer an explanation of the full range of human perception capabilities, but its chief advantage lies in its ability to explain common characteristics of human and non-human speech perception and production. Since the theory is not really committed to gestures per se as the fundamental unit of phonological representations, it is also not vulnerable to the kind of flaws that were associated to the motor theory, which had said that speech perception and production link is necessary. Another kind of model, a different kind of model of speech perception that is more popular and more recent is the fuzzy logic model of speech perception. Now, it is different from both the general auditory and the motor theory of speech perception in that it says that a better approach or a general auditory tradition is that there is a single set of ideal or prototype representations of speech sounds as determined by their acoustic characteristics. Now, according to this FLMP model, speech perception reflects the outcomes of two kinds of processes. There are bottom up processes, which are the mental operations that analyze the acoustic properties of the incoming speech stimulus, and there are top down processes which activate a set of potentially matching phonological representations. So, imagine if you are listening to a sound, if somebody is speaking something to you, one set is already analyzing the incoming signal in terms of very basic physical characteristics, and the other set of operation is trying to look into your memory as to whatever information about this particular sound you have. and they meet somewhere in the middle, and then you can understand whatever sound is produced. Now, it needs to specify that there are a lot of stored representations of phonemes, and they are activated to different degrees, and they are similar to acoustic properties in the speech stimulus. More similar phonemes attain higher degrees of activation, less similar phonemes achieve lower degrees of activation. So, if you listen to a particular sound, all those sounds similar to this incoming sound that you have heard of will all get activated, and they will potentially be matched against this incoming sound. The top-down processes are these mental operations that use the information in long-term memory to try and select the best possible candidate from among the set of candidates activated by the bottom-up processes. So, the bottom-up analysis has activated so many candidates which you can potentially match to any of this incoming information, and the top-down mental operations are actually doing this matching, and they are trying to select the best possible candidate which will match this incoming stimulus. Once that match is made, you understand that particular stimulus if you have heard of it earlier. This may be especially important if the incoming information is ambiguous or degraded. Let me take an example. Say for example, when the N phoneme precedes the B sound, say for example in the case of lean bacon, and if I am saying it very fast, lean bacon, oftentimes the co-articulation, because N and B are coming so close together, a lot of people might perceive this as lean bacon. If I am saying N and B so close together, word lean will be perceived as lean, and a lot of people will report saying hearing lean bacon. If you just want to do it, you can say this very fast again and again to yourselves, and then you can see that what is happening. Now, say when somebody listens to lean bacon, bottom-up processes will activate both the prototypes. It will activate N and it will activate M. So, there could be lean bacon and lean bacon, both will be activated. According to the fuzzy logic model of speech perception, our knowledge that lean bacon is actually a meaningful word and is a likely representation in English will cause us to favor lean bacon over lean bacon, and that is how we will understand whatever has been said. However, if the N word, say for example in a non-word such as pleat bacon, and if I will say pleen bacon or something like that, a listener will be more likely to favor the M interpretation, because the opening sound would not receive any support from top-down processes, because there is nothing I know that is called pleen bacon. So, I will go by the bottom-up analysis and I will pick up something that is coming from there. Now, this tendency to perceive ambiguous speech stimuli as real words is possible. Real words is actually called the Ganong effect, named after William Ganong in 1980. FLMP also offers a mechanism that can produce what is called phonemic restoration effects. Now, phonemic restoration basically is when speech stimuli are edited to create gaps. Say for example, if you remember, I was talking in an earlier class about legislatures, and there was this experiment and people were hearing the word legislatures on the headphones, and there was a coughing sound where the S is there. So, legi, cuff and latures experiment. What people do is people do report hearing the S even if though there is no S presented in the signal itself. What is happening here is that you are using your previous knowledge of the word legislatures to fill in that S, and you do it so well that you are convinced that there was an S in that signal. Now, these phonemic restoration effects are stronger for longer words than shorter words, because these make much more sense and are more grammatical than shorter words which are ungrammatical and they might not make sense. Further, the specific phoneme that is restored can also depend on the meaning of the sentence that is edited. Okay, so for example, if there is a different thing, if you are hearing the coughing sound, let us say the wagon lost its, and there is a coughing sound eel, you will most likely hear the word W. So, because you will hear the wagon lost its wheel, which is the more probable thing. But if you hear the circus train has lost, lost a trained eel, and there is a coughing sound before eel, you will probably think that you are talking about S, you are hearing an S there, because the circus generally has animals like seals, and you will say that maybe the sound that was there was S. So, how you will do the phonemic restoration actually depends on the context that is built in the sentence previously. Research involving ERPs have shown that nervous system does register the presence of the coughing noise very soon after it appears in the stimulus. So what is happening is you are registering the coughing sound very early, but you are doing all the mental processes possible to fill up that space that is created by the coughing sound. All of these suggest that there are a variety of possible sources of top-down information, and these various sources of information can affect the way an acoustic signal is perceived. Further, they suggest that the perception of speech involves analyzing the signal as well as biasing the results of this analysis based on how well different candidate representations fit in with the other aspects of the message. So you might have be biased to hear wheel or seal or anything else, but because I was talking about the wagon, you would fill it with wheel because that fits in better, and you will not fill S there because and you will fill S in the circus example because wheel does not fit there better. So you are doing this different kind of calculations, and you are online correcting your perception of speech there. These other aspects could include whether the phonological representations result in a real word or not, whether the semantic interpretation of the sentence makes sense or not, and how intact the top-down information is. If you do not remember the word exactly, if you do not remember what animal the circus has, if you do not have any language, any knowledge about the animals of the circus, then you might not be able to fill the example there with S as to seal. If you are living in a particular place wherein circuses do typically have seals, then you will create the sentence that the circus has lost a trained seal. This is all about speech perception that we will be talking about. In the next class, we will begin talking about attention as a cognitive phenomenon. Thank you.